All right, so we've got a pretty hefty stack of reports and articles here all about global trade tensions.
Yeah. Not
Seems like
good.
you're really trying to get a handle on this whole situation, and honestly, who isn't?
Yeah, it's definitely a topic on everyone's mind.
We're wading into some pretty dense territory
Yeah.
here, but that's kind of what we do best, right?
Yeah.
Unpacking this complex stuff
Yeah.
and, finding those hidden aha moments that you might have missed on your own.
Absolutely. And I think what's particularly fascinating about this current situation is that it feels like we're moving beyond simple trade disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
We're moving into like a phase of strategic economic maneuvering.
Okay, so less about trade itself
Uh,
and more about using it as a tool for power.
yeah, you could say that it's not just about tariffs anymore. It's about using trade as a lever to achieve broader geopolitical goals.
That's kind of unsettling.
It can be,
Yeah.
especially when you consider the players involved. It's not just the US and China anymore. Although they are certainly at the forefront, the EU is trying to carve out its own space.
Mhm.
Japan is navigating these shifting alliances carefully,
Mm.
and even Taiwan is getting caught in the crossfire.
And speaking of getting caught in the crossfire, all of the sources that you sent point to this one material that seems to be a focal point in this whole economic chess match, something called polyacetyl copolymers.
Yes, polyacetyl copolymers. You probably haven't heard of them, but I guarantee you interact with them every day.
All right, you got my attention. What exactly are these polyacetyl copolymers and why should I care about them?
Well, think about the tiny connectors inside your smartphone or the gears in your car's transmission.
Okay.
Those are the kinds of applications where polyacetyl copolymers really shine.
Mm.
They're high-performance plastics, incredibly strong, resistant to wear and tear, and able to withstand high temperatures.
So my car is basically a pawn in this global trade war. Who knew? But seriously, it sounds like these materials are pretty essential for a lot of industries.
They are, and that's why China's decision to impose anti-dumping tariffs on polyacetyl copolymers is so significant.
Mm.
It shows how these trade wars are moving beyond these abstract economic concepts and are impacting the very products we use every day.
Hold on, anti-dumping. What are these countries just giving away plastic for free or something?
Not quite. Dumping is a trade tactic where a country floods another country's market with goods priced below fair market value,
Ah,
often to gain market share and drive out competition.
okay.
China is essentially accusing the US, the EU, Japan, and Taiwan of doing just that with polyacetyl copolymers.
So it's all about protecting their domestic industry.
Gotcha. But the sources mention some pretty hefty tariffs, and they're not all the same.
Right.
The US seems to be hit the hardest with rates as high as 74.9%.
Yeah.
The EU faces 42%, Japan 43.7%, and Taiwan 32.6%.
Yeah.
What's behind those different rates?
That's where it gets really interesting. Those varying rates suggest that China isn't just trying to protect its domestic industry. They're using these tariffs to strategically pressure each country differently.
For example, that higher rate on U.S. goods could be a direct response to the Biden administration's decision to increase tariffs on Chinese manufactured electric vehicles up to a staggering 100%.
So they're basically playing hardball, using these tariffs as bargaining chips in a much larger economic negotiation.
Exactly. And it highlights the fact that we're not just talking about these abstract economic policies here. We're talking about real-world consequences for businesses, consumers, and the entire global economy.
Yeah, it really is a high-stakes game.
Yeah.
And this whole polyacetyl copolymer case is a prime example of how these seemingly isolated trade disputes can have really far-reaching consequences.
You know, it's funny. Before we started this deep dive, I thought tariffs were just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
But now I'm starting to see how they can directly impact what I pay for my car.
Right.
Or even if I can get my hands on the latest smartphone.
Exactly. And the polyacetyl copolymer situation is a perfect illustration of how these tariffs can disrupt entire supply chains. Can you break that down a bit more for me? How do these tariffs actually lead to those disruptions?
Well, imagine you're a Chinese company that makes electric car parts. You've been relying on a U.S. supplier for your polyacetyl copolymers.
Okay.
But now with these tariffs in place, that U.S. supplier is suddenly a lot more expensive.
So what are your options at that point? Do you just eat the extra cost?
You could try, but that's gonna cut into your profits and potentially make your products less competitive. You could try to pass the cost on to consumers, but that risks pricing yourself out of the market.
Right, so you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. What's the other option?
You could try to find a new supplier in a country that isn't subject to those tariffs. Maybe you look to Europe, Japan, or even try to source domestically within China.
But wouldn't that be really difficult? I mean, switching suppliers isn't exactly flipping a switch, right?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
You have to vet new suppliers, negotiate contracts, potentially even redesign your products to work with different materials.
Right.
All of that takes time and resources.
And in the meantime, your production could be slowed down or even halted completely.
Exactly. And those delays can cascade through the entire supply chain. It impacts your suppliers, your customers, and ultimately consumers like you.
So it's like a domino effect where one little push can set off this huge chain reaction.
That's a great analogy. And it really highlights why these trade wars are so risky. They can create this ripple effect that's hard to predict and even harder to control.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it still feels like we're talking about problems without solutions. Is there any way to de-escalate these tensions and get back to a more stable global trading system?
There are no easy answers, but I do believe there are paths towards a more cooperative and less volatile trade environment.
Okay.
It's going to require a shift in mindset from all the major players involved.
What kind of shift are we talking about?
Well, for starters, we need less saber-rattling and more genuine dialogue.
Mm.
Countries need to be willing to sit down at the negotiating table and address their concerns constructively instead of resorting to these tit-for-tat tariffs.
So more diplomacy, less economic warfare.
Mm.
I can get behind that. But talk is cheap. What about the actual policies? What needs to change there?
We need to move away from this narrow focus on protecting domestic industries at all costs.
Okay.
Instead, we need to start thinking about how to create a more level playing field that benefits everyone.
That sounds fair in principle, but how do we actually get there in practice?
It involves tackling some tough issues, things like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and unfair government subsidies. These are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed through negotiations and enforceable agreements, not unilateral tariffs.
It sounds like we need a global rule book for trade,
Yeah. Yeah.
one that everyone agrees to play by.
Yeah.
But how do we actually get all these countries to agree on something like that? It seems like everyone's just looking out for their own interests.
It's definitely a challenge, but I don't think it's an insurmountable one.
Okay.
I think the key is to really highlight the benefits of cooperation and the risks of continued conflict. A full-blown global trade war would be devastating for everyone.
Yeah.
It would lead to higher prices, reduced economic growth, and potentially even political instability.
Right. Nobody wins in a trade war. But what about the concerns of individual countries? How do we address those without resorting to protectionist measures?
One way is to focus on education and workforce development.
Okay.
We need to equip workers with the skills they need to thrive in a globalized economy. This can help to alleviate some of the anxieties that fuel protectionist sentiment.
That makes sense. If people feel confident in their ability to compete globally, they'll be less likely to support policies that restrict trade.
Exactly. We also need to foster greater understanding and cooperation between countries. This can be done through cultural exchanges, educational programs, and people-to-people diplomacy. The more we understand each other's perspectives, the less likely we are to see trade as a zero-sum game.
So building bridges instead of walls? I like that.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic. These are massive systemic issues. What can I as an individual actually do to make a difference in all of this? It feels kind of overwhelming.
It's easy to feel powerless in the face of global challenges, but you actually have more influence than you might think. It all starts with staying informed. Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one,
Right.
and engage in thoughtful discussions about these issues.
So knowledge is power. But what do I do with that knowledge?
You use it to make your voice heard. Contact your elected officials, support organizations that promote fair and sustainable trade practices, and talk to your friends and family about these issues.
Okay.
The more people who understand the complexities of global trade, the better equipped we'll be to push for policies that benefit everyone.
I hadn't thought about it that way. It's empowering to know that I can actually make a difference.
You absolutely can. And don't underestimate the power of personal connections. Reach out to people from different cultures, learn about their perspectives, and challenge your own assumptions. Building bridges of understanding is one of the most powerful things you can do.
This has been incredibly insightful. I started this deep dive feeling a bit lost and confused about all these trade wars, but now I feel like I have a much better grasp on what's at stake and what we can all do to create a more positive future.
It's been a pleasure exploring these complex issues with you. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a more just and prosperous world.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of trade wars and polyacetyl copolymers. We hope you've learned something new, gained a fresh perspective, and maybe even felt a spark of inspiration to make a difference.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep connecting.
This is the Deep Dive signing off.